A busy day in Washington where both former Vice President Mike Pence and former President Donald Trump are making keynote speeches today. Right now, Vice President Pence is taking questions at the annual National Conservative Student Conference. Let's take a listen as he just mentioned in his comments that elections are about the future, he said, and that there's a temptation to go backwards, but he has to be bold and things about bringing America back. Let's listen in.
The economy has grown the more they've invested in a military that demonstrates aggression in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Straits. And the more their military has grown, most grievously, religious persecution against Christians and Muslim Uyghurs has increased in human rights abuses. And Jimmy Lai is a business leader in Hong Kong who languishes in jail right now, a man of profound Christian faith. His only offense is that he believed in freedom for the people of Hong Kong. So I think there's no shortcut to what we need to do to continue to defend the interest of freedom in the Asia Pacific, and that is we need to invest in the strongest military in the history of the world and make it stronger still. We need to redouble our commitment to defend our treaty allies all across the Asia Pacific. And in that sense, I think that we answer that moment with China. Continuing tariffs that we placed on China to hold them accountable for their trade abuses, that we call them out on the espionage and intellectual property theft in which they've engaged in extraordinary numbers in recent years. But more than anything else, the way we can look after our friends and allies in Taiwan, the way we can look after all the freedom-loving nations of the Asia Pacific, is renew our commitment to have the strongest military in the world and to preserve a free and open Indo-Pacific with American strength. Well, you all have a great day ahead of you. Betsy DeVos, Ben Carson, but let me just say thank you again on behalf of my wife and all of us in this movement. Thanks for stepping forward to lead. I know that I am looking at a generation that will lead this country, a generation that will turn this country around. Just do everything in your part, in your heart of hearts, to be the freedom generation, YAF, because the best is yet to come. Thank you very much. God bless you.
All right, you were just listening there to Mike Pence give an address, keynote address at a student convention. Their CBS News chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett is with us now to offer his analysis of Pence's speech. Major, what else stood out to you in listening to the former vice president?
Okay, so good morning. First thing, this is a big day in Washington for the future of the Republican Party and the conservative movement in a post-Trump era, if there is going to be a post-Trump era. Former President Trump is here in Washington. He'll give a speech later on this afternoon. Vice President Mike Pence was scheduled to give the speech he just gave last night, but now they're on dueling days. Same day, nearly the same venues right across town from one another. So a great number of Republicans, not only here in this conference room that I'm attending, but across the country are going to be sort of sifting through these two speeches. And Mike Pence went to great lengths to charitably describe the Trump-Pence administration and its agenda. Did not criticize the president at all, except to say that they differ on focus, because he knows former President Trump continues to falsely claim the 2020 election was stolen and relitigate that. Vice President Pence, who obviously stood at a very important crossroads in American political and constitutional history on January 6th, didn't want to get into any of those details, just say I want to focus on the future. And the other thing that struck me, and I think it's really important as Republicans talk about the future of their movement and what direction it takes, under the banner of freedom, former Vice President Pence emphasized culture over economics. That is a switch for historically conservative and Republican people in American politics. Always it was economics first, culture second. No. Former Vice President said it is culture first that will define the future of American politics and freedom. And at the center of that culture war, he said, those are his words, not mine, is sanctity of life, code word for bringing so-called legislation to oppose abortion rights, not to states just where it's already happening, but to every state in the nation. And that means, under the banner of freedom and culture, former Vice President Pence said, eradicating the right to abortion nationwide must be the first and foremost goal of that culture agenda. Those two things, tiptoeing around former President Trump, not trying to divide the party or really pick a fight with him, point one. Point two, when talking about the future of conservatism and republicanism, former Vice President Pence emphasized culture over economics, and at the center of that culture agenda, which he described part and parcel with freedom, was essentially eradicating the right to abortion all across the country at the state level.
And Major, I find it quite remarkable that the former vice president offered what seemingly are milquetoast references to the former president, when we know, based on the testimony that we've been hearing in the January 6th committee, that the former vice president and members of his staff were in dire straits on January 6th. I note that in making his remarks about January 6th, he called it just another tragic day in our nation's history. He seemed to lump it in with a bunch of other things. What did he say exactly?
So he said it was a tragic day, but really glossed over all of January 6th. And to your point, Vlad, right behind this camera position, I'm standing about 2/3 into this conference room here at the JW Marriott in downtown Washington, D.C. Right behind me, right behind this camera position, was Mark Short, watching the speech, former Vice President Pence's chief of staff, who has testified before the January 6th committee. We've seen that in the public hearings. And we learned yesterday he testified last week before a federal grand jury, in both cases under subpoena. So it's not like he's running to tell tales on the Trump administration, but he is clearly cooperating in two separate investigations into what happened and the possible criminal implications of what happened on January 6th. And for all of the rhetoric from the former vice president about strength, freedom, leadership, defining character, defining strength, that was a moment in his career where he defined strength, says, and many agree on the conservative right, that he upheld the Constitution under tremendous pressure, rhetorically and personally, from former President Trump, and withstood a mob in the United States Capitol that was trying to attack the process of certifying an election and him personally. And to not talk about that and not to say, you know, we do have a disagreement within this party, and it's a really important one, and I'd like to highlight why I did what I did. No. Because the former vice president, for whatever reason, has calculated that, as true as he may believe all that is, there's very little political percentage in him to do that. So I think the fairest way to describe it is glossing over those fundamental differences and saying, I just want to talk about the future. I don't really want to talk about the past. Ladies and gentlemen, the past matters. January 6th matters. It matters not only in the fate of the country, but it matters specifically in the fate of the Republican Party, because what you decide January 6th was or wasn't will determine what side of the Republican Party you fall on in the future. And for that, former Vice President Mike Pence had almost nothing to say.
And Major, you know, the former President Donald Trump had "Make America Great Again." Are we to read into former Vice President Mike Pence saying "Bring America Back" during his speech? And what are you hearing from some of those young conservatives in the crowd when it comes to potentially supporting a Mike Pence for president on the Republican ticket as opposed to a Donald Trump?
So this is an interesting barometer of that very question. And let's be honest, Mike Pence, as he walked out, got a standing ovation. As he concluded his remarks, he got a standing ovation. And as he left the stage, he got a standing ovation. So that's not bad. But I've watched a lot of standing ovations, and I've certainly seen a lot of ovations for former President Trump, then candidate and President Trump, and they don't compare. The enthusiasm in this room I would describe as genuine, mildly enthusiastic, and mostly polite. There wasn't a sense in this room that this group of young conservatives at college campuses around the country were looking at the next great leader of their party. There was genuine enthusiasm, but I would say it was on the polite, not raucous side. And there were lots of people who stood in line who wanted to ask questions to the vice president. The mics had about 20 people behind them to ask questions on both sides. it was very quickly announced, the vice president has time for 2 questions. And so all these young conservatives who wanted to engage with the former vice president sort of slumped their heads and walked back to their seats. Oh, I guess I can't ask my question. I'm not sure if the vice president's time is that valuable or he was just a little bit nervous about taking lots of questions. Either way, he left lots of people who wanted to engage with him in this room wanting a little bit more.
So, Major, it's interesting because I asked Leslie Sanchez, as you know, who's a CBS News Republican strategist, about this a couple of weeks ago on the air, and pointing out that Liz Cheney, for example, who is sitting on that January 6th committee, is as conservative as they come. In almost every aspect of her politics, she would be considered an extreme conservative in some cases. But Leslie said something interesting to me. She said, you know, Liz Cheney and that brand of conservatism, that Ronald Reagan conservatism, that Bush conservatism, is no longer the stripe that runs through the Republican Party. And so what you're kind of describing there is what I would suspect is Mike Pence being cut from that same cloth. The Republican Party is increasingly the party of the Lauren Boeberts and the Jim Jordans and the Louis Gohmerts and the Matt Gaetzes, and not folks like Mike Pence. And so it begs the question, how is Pence's vision for the future of the Republican Party different from that of former President Trump and those firebrands like the Marjorie Taylor Greenes?
So the former vice president has an opening to have this kind of conversation because he is, in every way, and was as vice president, as doggedly devoted to the Trump agenda as any human being could possibly be, except for one enormous moment in American history, January 6th, and everything that led up to it. He has a moment to describe, look, ladies and gentlemen, I believe in the Trump agenda. I was there. I helped make it happen. I was President Trump's central interlocutor with Republicans on Capitol Hill. I was in all the rooms. I helped negotiate all the things that you liked about the Trump administration and would like to see continue. I can do that work, but I can't do that work if we have this ongoing disagreement about the 2020 election. And to say only, I want to focus on the future and not the past, describe that as the divide in the Republican Party between Trump and Pence, simply oversimplifies something of very large importance and a defining moment in Mike Pence's constitutional, political, and leadership career. And if you're not going to define your defining moment, what are you giving people? An anodyne version of Trump light? I mean, that's what the speech sounded like to me, because he kept saying the Trump-Pence agenda, Trump-Pence agenda. Well, guess who's second in that listing? Pence. So if you're not going to describe exactly what it was that was different about you, different in a moment of crisis, different in a moment that will go down in American history, not just for decades, for as long as American history is written, January 6th will be there. And he's a central figure. And why is he a central figure? Because he didn't do the unconstitutional and illegal thing the President of the United States asked him to. Why you would not want to highlight and say, you know what, ladies and gentlemen, the conservative movement, young leaders of the future, we're at a crossroads. I took one path, and it's the right path. And here's why you need to know it's the right path and not play with the idea of authoritarian interventions to overturn American elections, because that's why Mike Pence did what he did. And to leave that on the table unaddressed seems to me to be politically cautious, to be sure, but also, to use a phrase from a completely different context, hiding your lamp under a bushel. That's a lamp. That's a moment of leadership, whatever you think about it, but he thinks it's important, and certainly the Constitution and the history of our country will deem it as such. But he hit it here for cautious and, it seems to me, calculating political reasons.
All right, Major Garrett for us in Washington, D.C., covering Mike Pence's first sort of significant speech in the area, which, of course, will obviously have more from the former president later this afternoon, Major, and we'll see if former President Trump is as
cautious
and graceful and charitable as Mike Pence seemingly was to him. Major Garrett, always good to have you, my friend. Thank you.
See you.